Hi everyone. Apologies for starting a little late. To tell the truth, I am quite technologically incompetent and had started speaking to a non-broadcasting Google Hangout for quite some time before I realized that I had neglected to click start broadcast and that I had just been monologuing for like 10 minutes. So sorry, hopefully it's going to work now. The second thing to note about my technological incompetence is that I tried for ages to get a PowerPoint and a screen share set up and wasn't able to manage it. So the link to the PowerPoint that I'm going to be using for today's live hangout on art is attached in the description of this video. And so if you want to click it to follow along, that might be useful because at some points I'll be referencing art pieces, and it's sometimes good to be able to see the art piece without having to Google it on the way, because that saves you time. So today I'm going to be talking about art and culture, and I'm just going to start by throwing out some thoughts that I have about art motions, which might not be particularly interesting, but I think might be nice to hear anyway. So the first thing is that art motions tend to come up a lot more than most people think they come up. And the reason for that is because art itself is a lot more varied than what many people think when they hear the word art. So art isn't just about bowls of fruit on a table or beautiful classical paintings or beautiful classical music. It's also about all the kinds of art forms that we normally use to enjoy ourselves or to relieve tension after a long day. It encapsulates music and literature and rap. And if you're following along on the PowerPoint, this should all be on the second slide. Sorry again, I really am going to try to flag slide changes whenever they come up, although I may forget to. So hopefully it's going to be fairly obvious for when I move on from one to the other. So yes, art is more varied than what you normally think of off the top of your head. The second thing to think about when we've settled that art is more varied than what we think it is what are art debates about? And I think most people tend to panic when they see art debates because they think that they're screwed if they don't remember the name of every art piece they saw on that sixth grade trip to the museum, or if they aren't able to recite the names of Italian artists at the drop of the head. The good news is most art debates aren't actually about art, or they're not exclusively about art. So in fact, many art debates tend to begin from the assumption that art can influence the world in some way, and then asks debaters whether or not this influence is socially utile. So for example, take the motion, this house would subsidize art that glorifies the working class. It's teams going to choose to debate about art being useless or run a case about whether or not the government should never subsidize any form of art. The value of art tends to be assumed in this case, and then the debate just becomes about whether we want this sort of outcome and whether we think that this is a good way of getting about it, and whether the government has the ability to do it or something like that. Similar with the motion, this house would censor offensive art or use offense as a justification to censor certain art pieces. This is a motion that we'll be discussing a bit later as well. But it's mostly a discussion about censorship and the nature of censorship and what role the government is able to play in restricting art forms, how censorship disproportionately impacts certain groups, things like that, as opposed to about describing that particular type of art or explaining why that art is so bad. Yeah, so I think the main clashes you would probably see in most kinds of arts debates, and the clashes that I'm going to try and hit in today's discussion, are threefold. And I think this is on the third slide, if any of you are looking at a PowerPoint. The first is that a question of whether or not art is uniquely valuable, or whether we can get the effects we would like from art from something else. And I think this is an important clash because very often, if we're thinking of getting some kind of social outcome, and art is one of the ways we can get there, if it's not the only way we can get there, we might want to think about how else we might want to produce those kinds of social outcomes instead. So there has to be something uniquely valuable about art for the government to want to do things like subsidize a fine arts education, or subsidize public art, or subsidize entry to museums. Because if you can get it from somewhere else, if you can get whatever enjoyment or cognitive value you get from art from another source, there's no reason for the government to do any of these things. I think the second clash is something like, is there a form of art that we should prioritize over other forms of art? Or what kind of things should we value when we see particular artworks, assuming that art does have value, right? So this is about whether or not we think art should be more abstract and conceptual versus being more accessible to the general public and more representational, whether we would like things like highbrow art, so museum art and those old Italian artists painting greats, over lowbrow entertainment, so like Hollywood, pop songs, or whether we think public art, so graffiti and street art and artists like Banksy, are as worthy of being called artists as those who have their art exhibited within the museum. I think the third clash is a question of who gets to profit from art, right? Who gets to do things with art, who gets to use certain art forms. And here later on, we'll be talking a bit about cultural appropriation and commodification versus cultural preservation, whether or not we should repatriate art to its countries of origins versus keeping them in museums, etc. Yeah, so those are the clashes. I'm going to start by talking about whether or not art is uniquely valuable. And to do that, I think I'm going to start by talking about what art does for people, not just the viewers, but also the artist. This might be useful in explaining, like I said earlier, why governments might want to subsidize art or subsidize a fine arts education when there aren't often many practical benefits to doing so. So, to take a very brief segue here, perhaps knowing what art does requires knowing what art is, but the problem is that there isn't usually a fixed definition of art that we can refer to and whip out. Because art is many things, right? We just said earlier that art can be traditional art, modern art. It can be both representational and conceptual, can be both technical and abstract. Art belongs to and is produced by every single culture in the world, but not every single culture has the same idea of what art is. And you get art that subverts the status quo, and you get art that affirms it. So, to give you a couple of very disparate examples, the Mona Lisa is art, and so is Guernica, despite coming from completely different time periods and completely different painting styles. Duchamp's fountain is art, despite the fact that it's a ready-made urinal that Duchamp just kind of signed his name onto it. So is Black Square, which is, if you look at what slide 2, I think, is the painting of a black square that's to the left of the slide. It's literally just a painting of a black square, and it's very conceptual. And there's also artwork that's just sharks preserved in formaldehyde, and that's the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living. So there isn't a single definition of art, and that's something to keep in mind, because what art does is, to a certain extent, dependent on what you think art is. I think I'm going to go through a couple of paradigms that people can use to think about what the value of art is, because I think those are probably the most useful for the kinds of debates that people will probably see about art. The first paradigm is kind of a paradigm of experiential value. And I think this is probably on slide 5. Sorry, I forgot to tell people to click again. And this paradigm basically says the value of art is the value of whatever experience that art is able to create in the minds of the viewer. So very simple experiential value, the value is experience. Art is valuable because it allows us to undergo pleasurable experiences, right? We feel a sense of awe and a sense of smallness almost when we see the Sistine Chapel and the amount of skill it took to paint that much. And the sheer scale, the magnitude of the paintings in the Sistine Chapel really cause you to realize that art is just a great human endeavor stretching back hundreds of years. We get the shivers when we hear a particularly haunting melody. We find it really satisfying when we read a phrase in a novel that we love that perfectly encapsulates a situation, or we find a sentence that is able to just so neatly convey the character of somebody that you're reading about. All of that's great. And the upside of this kind of account, right? This experiential value account is that most art does evoke emotional responses, and it's a common sense explanation of why people in real life think art is important, right? Because sometimes, or quite often, those emotional responses are very pleasant. People turn to art to lose themselves, to escape their troubles, to live briefly in an alternate world that is less bleak and more beautiful than the life that they're currently living, right? They do it after a long day, after they get out of work. They do it on the commute home to try and block out the noise around them. And that's, I think, a large reason why people in real life, maybe not in debate world, think art is important. And this is just quite separate from what we think art does in terms of critiquing systems. And sometimes art doesn't evoke pleasant emotional responses. Sometimes art inspires grief, disgust, anger, which often leads individuals to do things like censor or deface provocative works. It's quite amazing, really, how often provocative works get defaced, or how often people rage enough to run all the way to a museum with a hammer and attempt to knock the statue off plinth or deface this Christ. Yeah, a lot of emotions going on there. So I think there are also a few challenges to this account of artistic value. And the first challenge is that it's just not clear that experiential values are unique to art. So I might feel a sense of awe, or a sense of smallness, or a sense of, wow, nature is really cool, or wow, history is amazing, looking at the Grand Canyon. But I just genuinely doubt that a Grand Canyon would be considered art. And I might also try to drown my sorrows in alcohol or by going out with friends after a very long day. But I don't think that would be considered art either by most people's common sense definitions of the word. So what differentiates art from other things that bring us pleasurable experiences? I think perhaps it's a question of intent, in that the things that I just talked about were not deliberately created or crafted to create certain outcomes. So we may experience similar feelings in other situations, but those feelings were not created with any kind of greater goal in mind. The second challenge to this kind of account, this experiential value account, is that it can't explain why we find forgeries and reproductions to be less artistic than the original. Because if the value of art is just about a combination of the form and the content of art creating a pleasurable experience for people, then why is there such an uproar when we discover that previously beloved paintings were forgeries? Presumably, right, the viewer derives some kind of pleasure from viewing that art, and the art itself, or the physical form of the art, doesn't actually change when we discover that it's a forgery. So those experiences shouldn't automatically become void, which means there should be just as much value in a forgery than in another painting. To give an example here, in 2011, this respected art dealer that I think is based in New York, Noodler and Company, closed down when it was found to have sold more than 30 art forgeries for $63 million. That's a lot of money. One of those forgeries is actually now the subject of a lawsuit. It's a forgery of a Rothko painting, and a Rothko painting is like just strips of color drawn and layered upon each other. It was sold originally for $8.3 million, and the person that bought it, the collector, when he discovered it was a forgery, took this art dealer company to court, presumably to attempt to recover the value of the Rothko. Interestingly enough, when this Rothko, this fake Rothko, was originally displayed, famed art critic Ernst Bayerle called it a sublime work of art, which is really high praise, probably. And the collector who bought the painting presumably also found it to have quite a level of artistic value, because, like, why else would he spend $8 million on it? So does the value of the art then disappear? Is it the moment it's no longer original, right? When it's found to be a forgery, it honestly shouldn't, because the same qualities that made it look sublime originally still exist in the art. But clearly, the value in the eyes of the collector and in the eyes of the public has changed. So what exactly is it about originals that we find to be more valuable than non-originals? Um, so maybe in addition to providing a valuable kind of experience, artworks are valuable because each work is a genuine and unique piece of expression that's created with the intent to make people have those experiences rather than just created with the intent of making people money. Which is, I think, what most forgeries and replicas probably are, created with the intent of commercial purposes. Or maybe we find original art to be valuable because it highlights the creativity of an artist in a way that a replica just doesn't. I'm going to continue on here by discussing aesthetic value and cognitive value. And if you click to the next slide, I think I've put in a slide about a set of motions that is relevant to the next two paradigms and the two frameworks that we'll be discussing. So the first motion is a motion that was set at the Australasian Championships last year. This house regrets the trend away from valuing art for its technical qualities in favor of its abstract characteristics. So, like whether or not we should value brushstrokes and paint compositions rather than the idea behind the artwork. And the second motion, I think, is a motion that comes out more often. This house would only subsidize art that's understandable to the public. And iterations of this motion include things like this house would only subsidize art that has been judged worthy by a panel of ordinary citizens, or like this house would only subsidize art that has been judged against the work of a 5-year-old and found superior, which is like this riff of the very mimetic statement, my 5-year-old could have done that. So, aesthetic value, which is the second framework I'm going to talk about. If you look at the Austral's motion, when it says valuing art for its technical qualities, that's exactly what the framework of aesthetic value does. This framework basically says the value of art is partially created by its formal qualities. So the kinds of lines, shapes, patterns, the colors, the composition of the artwork, all of that creates some kind of value, all these formalistic technical elements working together. This isn't to say that the content of the work doesn't matter, but it just means that our engagement with the content and our responses to whatever the artwork is depicting is guided by the specific formal features of the work. So we enjoy art not just because of its message, but because the form of the work is an especially artful and especially skillful way of conveying that message. So the pleasure that we derive from the content or the subject of art is not independent of the form of that art. So if you're following on the slides, on slide 7 is an image of the painting Judith beheading Holofernes. It's by an artist whose name I can't quite remember right now, but she was a female artist, and part of the art like theory or the discussion surrounding this work is that she was sexually assaulted, and so a lot of this painting is colored by her own experiences with sexual assault and sexual abuse. But if you look at the painting, Holofernes' head is kind of positioned near the center. It's the focus of the painting, and the rest of the action radiates out from around it, almost like the rays radiating out of a cartoon sun. The lines of Judith's arms and the arms of her maidservant draw attention to the looks of concentration on their faces. And you can also see from their positionings around Holofernes, as well as Holofernes' like struggling legs, which form the rest of the action. From that, you can really see the intense physical effort needed to finish the deed. And the skillful use of light and shade in this also forward the representation of just intense dramatic action, because it's almost pitch blackness surrounding the central action of the painting, which is relatively well lit. And you can also see that light kind of glowing off the really rich fabrics in the bed covers and the dresses the women are wearing. So it's a study in contrasts and light and shadow, action, things like that. And crucially, a lot of that is just down to how skillfully this was painted, right? With how skillfully colors were used, how juxtaposition works, the kinds of lines that direct your eyes to various corners of the painting. All of that's the formal value of, the formal aspect of this piece. So an aesthetic account would say that the value of a painting like this comes from the interplay of its formal aspects and its thematic content, that we don't necessarily have to enjoy the idea of murder, but we can appreciate that this is a really skillful way of depicting that murder, assassination, what have you. And this account is really useful in a couple of ways, this aesthetic account. The first is because it really explains why we find good art to be non-replicable. So we can't replicate the effects of good art with an essay on the exact same subject, explaining that Judith had a really hard time cutting off Holofernes' head, because you just don't get the kind of formal elements or the interaction between formal elements and content there. It also allows us to explain why loads of people can appreciate artwork even if they disagree with the message behind it. And that's because they find the value of the art piece to be in the formal and technical aspects of it rather than in the message that it's sending. So for example, there are lots of famous religious paintings, right? Like The Last Supper, and there's of course Pieta, which is this depiction of the Virgin Mary cradling the dead body of Jesus, just depicted in a lot of different kinds of sculptures. And even non-religious individuals can, and they often do, appreciate religious art pieces like this, even if they might otherwise, in different aspects of their life, just vehemently oppose the idea of religion or organized religion. And that's because it's so beautifully done, right? It's because the form perfectly matches whatever the content is trying to portray. Of course, it's not like this is a perfect account of art, because this account foregrounds form rather than content. It can't really explain why we think that the choice of content can often diminish the artistic value of an artwork, even if it retains many formal aesthetic qualities. So, for example, if we think about films, movies, we might say something like, yeah, all the scenes were really beautifully shot, but the plot was just unbelievably dull. And I've definitely said that walking out of a movie. I'm just going to guess that you've probably said or thought something similar before. And when we compare these kinds of films, these beautifully shot films, just with like a really terrible plot, to other films that were just as beautifully shot, but with a better plot or with better acting or better lines, a better script, we would probably say that that's just better art, right? So if you have two films that are equally aesthetically pleasing, you would opt for the film with the better plot. If you have two paintings that are, again, equally aesthetically pleasing, you would probably opt for the painting with the better subject matter, regardless of how well that subject matter matches with whatever your formal qualities of the painting are. For the movie buffs among you, I've attached a link in the PowerPoint. It's called 12 Movies That Are Incredibly Beautiful and Utterly Vapid. And it's got a bunch of examples of films that are really nicely shot but don't have a lot, going on up there. And this is a problem, obviously, for the aesthetic account, because the aesthetic account says that regardless of what the content is, the formal qualities do outweigh all of it. I guess the way to resolve this would be to say that maybe it's not only about the formal qualities of the art, or not only about the aesthetic elements, but also about content. But that, isn't already, is I think conceding a little bit that the content or the ideas behind it are just as important. The second problem with this account is that it just can't explain why conceptual art should also be considered art. So Duchamp's fountain that we talked about earlier, literally just a standard urinal. There's an artist called Manzoni who sold an artwork called Artist's Shit, which is it just comprises of sealed tins containing his feces, and he sold them for their weight in gold, or at least he attempted to. I'm not really sure if anyone bought them. And the beautiful thing about this art piece is that nobody really wanted to open any of the sealed cans, right, to see if it was actually his thesis in there. So very, very abstract, very conceptual. Manzoni didn't just sell his thesis in tins. He also sold bodies of air, which is just his breath in balloons. He didn't sell this one for its weight in gold because it wouldn't have brought him very much money, but he did still sell it for a sizable sum. Fraser, who's a performance artist, recorded a sexual encounter that she had with a private collector in this 2003 art piece that's titled Untitled. And in all of these instances that I've just mentioned, this like shit in tins and breaths, like bags of air and a sexual encounter on tape, in all of that, the aesthetic qualities of the work just seem really subordinate to the recognition of the idea behind that work. And since many people would consider conceptual art to be art, maybe artistic value isn't solely derived from aesthetic value. Because if it was, we wouldn't consider any of these pieces to be art, even though they were quite integral to the way the artistic movement developed. So one way the aesthetic account might deal with this challenge is just to bite the bullet and say, yep, conceptual art is not art. My 5-year-old could do that. I could do that. What did they do? Just put a chair in a room and call it a piece of art. So the question then becomes a little bit about whether or not we think conceptual art has any value at all and whether art should be accessible. So I'll talk a little bit more about this later when I start talking about what value conceptual art actually has. But for now, just keep in mind that the aesthetic account is vulnerable to these kinds of challenges. I think it's probably time for the next slide. And I'm going to talk about this framework of cognitive value, which is another way of thinking about whether or not art has any kind of value whatsoever. So unlike the aesthetic account, the cognitive account of artistic value is quite friendly to conceptual art because it focuses on the ideas behind the artworks rather than how the art is created. So this account presumes that art is fundamentally communicative in nature, that it's about the promotion of an idea, that it can promote an idea or challenge existing ideas, subvert current norms or conceptions that we might have about the world. So that's the purpose of art in a sense. It's just to convey a concept or to argue about a concept. The cognitive and aesthetic accounts of art approach the same question from opposite directions. And so I think it's probably no surprise that the pitfall for the cognitive account is quite similar to the one for the aesthetic account. And the first challenge is just, what do we do with art that's just beautiful, with no kind of deeper underlying meaning behind it? So Caravaggio's basket of fruit is a still life of a basket of fruit. Cézanne's basket of apples is a still life of a basket of apples. Van Gogh's sunflower series is a series on sunflowers. I feel like these names are very self-explanatory, really. But the problem is that these works are all beautiful, right? And they're obviously great art. They've had huge impacts on just the way we understand what art history is. And those are the things that you would be able to name drop, and lots of people will be like, oh yeah, that art, I know what that looks like. But do they have cognitive value? And it's very difficult to think about what kind of cognitive value a painting of a bowl of apples could give you, right? So maybe under the cognitive account of what it means to be valuable, just still life or just pretty art doesn't have that much in the way of value. But the way I think the cognitive account can attempt to deal with this challenge is by thinking about what kind of cognitive value individuals develop as they view this kind of art. So for example, maybe if you view the sunflower series, it forces you to reflect on the choice of subject, right? What made Van Gogh find sunflowers so valuable that he spent an entire series on it? Or you might think about the experience of viewing the artwork. Or you might gain some improved cognitive skills in the ability to perceive patterns or symbols or contrasts or details, because all of these artworks are incredibly technically precise and complicated. You could stare at a piece of art and just find tiny details that artists added to make it look more realistic. Maybe a bit of shading that makes it look three-dimensional, or maybe a bit of brown that points to you that that apple has been sitting in the sun for a while. You can actually find out a lot of things just by looking at art very closely, and maybe that's a kind of cognitive value too, even if it doesn't present you with an idea or a concept that's just going to change the world as we know it. The second challenge to the cognitive account is that if we think that ideas are all that matter with art, should something that is thought-provoking and deeply insightful and innovative, but possessed of no aesthetic value whatsoever, be considered art? Should academic journals be considered art? Should papers be considered art? Should newspaper articles be art? Should history books be art? Should accounts of a war be art? And I don't know, should a debate be art? Some debate speeches are genuinely insightful and highly communicative in nature. And of course, the problem is if all of these things can fulfill the criteria of being conceptual and idea-filled, what really differentiates art from any other medium of communication? And here we run into the same problem again, which is that no one account of what the value of art is can encapsulate every single idea of what art is. And you really have to think about art in this instance as being different from other mediums, with the differentiating factor being how art is able to communicate these kinds of ideas. So works of art, for example, due to their technical aspect or due to their formal features, are able to engage our emotions, our affective responses, and make us care about the message being communicated in a way that journals and academic articles don't really, right? It enriches our understanding of the world, not by telling us facts about the world or by telling us what really happened, but by creating a kind of imagined space that we can inhabit, that allows us to think about different kinds of lives or different kinds of worlds, or a world where, for example, we prioritized art that glorified the working class or a Marxist revolution. All of those things that you just don't get from reading Karl Marx. So yes, that's all I have for the cognitive framework, as well as the various frameworks for evaluating the value of art. I think the thing about all these frameworks is that because art is so varied, no one framework can explain everything, and it would be a bit epistemically arrogant to think that one framework could cover everything. So in debates that, like the ones we saw earlier about regretting the move away from certain kinds of art forms into other kinds of art forms, you would want to consider not just what the intrinsic value of these art forms are, but also how people are likely to see them. So it might be very true that conceptual art, or that is basically like the ideas behind art, right? That it promotes a certain kind of concept. But maybe most people don't interact with art expecting it to be that. Maybe most people interact with art expecting it to be more technical or more representational, things like that. But it's, I think, always useful to have good frameworks you can start with. So this is as good a point as any to move on to what can art do. So slide 9, probably. I'm going to, in this section, talk about conceptual art, like the value of conceptual art, then talk a bit about art as activism, art and the artist, controversial art, censorship, art and authoritarianism, things like that. So the slightly more practical sides of what art does and what impacts it has in the world. That's just not how do we think art can be valuable. So conceptual art. Why do we want to fund things that are ugly and inspire rage and confusion and aren't really understandable to most people? So a quick overview of what conceptual art is, because again, there are as many kinds of conceptual art as there are conceptual artists, since it's based mostly on concepts. Conceptual art developed partially in response to a formalist movement that was prioritizing the technical aspects and technical qualities of art, as well as a lot of restrictive definitions about what art is and what art is supposed to be. So while there isn't a single fixed definition of conceptual art, which I think is probably quite appropriate given that conceptual art attempts to challenge definitions, there are a few characteristics that can differentiate conceptual art from other genres. So the first characteristic is that conceptual art often challenges our definition of what art is by presenting us with objects that we may or may not consider to be art, made with very non-traditional techniques and materials. So what most people think was the first conceptual art exhibition was curated by Bochner in 1966, and it was titled Working Drawings and Other Visible Things on Paper Not Necessarily Meant to Be Viewed as Art. So he had basically compiled a bunch of working drawings and like notes about art from various artists and displayed those papers in binders on plinths in a gallery. So is it art if the presenter puts it in a gallery, but then follows it up by explicitly saying that this is not art? Quite unclear. Lots of people dispute it, and because this is more like art as art criticism than straightforward art. There is also in many kinds of conceptual art an urge towards creative destruction. So the idea is that artists realized they didn't need to make something out of nothing. That very often meaning could also be derived by breaking down something that was made into its component parts or into some other form altogether. That destruction itself is a creative urge. So for example, in 1967, this man named Latham disagreed with a book by Clement Greenberg, and the book was titled Art and Culture. And Clement Greenberg had emphasized formalism and the formal content of art, which Latham just really disagreed with. So what he did was that he took out a copy of this book from the college library. He assembled a group of students at his home, had each student tear out a page, eat the page, chew the page, and then spit out the pulp. And Latham then used all of this saliva-soaked pulp to ferment with various chemicals and yeast. So when he received his overdue notice from the library, he didn't give them back the book because the book had been eaten and fermented. And what he did was he returned them a vial containing the distilled essence of Greenberg, and he was dismissed from his teaching post at this college. What do we make of this incident? The first is that destruction is often a way of conveying a message as well, and in this case, it conveyed a idea that was just dramatically opposed to the notion that formalism is the only way to do good art. And the second is just that very often materials don't even have to be used in a traditional manner in order to create conceptual art. The third thing to note about conceptual art is that it can often have a performance element. So the artwork relies on the existence of the viewer to be a participant in the creator of the artwork. So conceptual art doesn't exist without the viewer to also participate in the co-creation or the co-construction of the artwork. And I think possibly the best example of this is John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which involved a performer sitting at a piano in silence for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So what distinguishes this 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence from any other kind of silence is the expectation that the audience is participating in the creation of this art through actively listening, even though there is nothing to listen to. Another example is Di Maria's vertical earth kilometer. Di Maria created this by drilling a hole in the ground, inserting a brass rod into it, and then covering it with a sandstone plate. So viewers have actually never seen the artwork except for the sandstone plate and the, I think, inch of vertical brass rod that's sticking out of it. So it actually challenges viewers to imagine what this artwork that they have never seen and will never see would look like. The last thing that some conceptual art has is that it's often quite anti-consumerist and anti-establishment. So Manzoni's Artist Shit, as mentioned earlier, is an example of an artwork that probably wouldn't be a collector's work of art, or at the very least, it's difficult to imagine a collector paying out a large sum of money for it in the same way they would pay out a large sum of money for a Rothko or a Da Vinci or a Van Gogh. Of course, a lot of anti-consumerist art still gets sold for a lot of money, but the point is that it does attempt to challenge the establishment, to challenge capitalism, to challenge existing norms that we have. Okay, so what then is the value of conceptual art? I guess the most obvious one is that conceptual art is a form of response to the world, right? It finds some kind of issue that the artist is passionate about and comments on it in a really fresh and surprising manner. So by presenting a specific issue, conceptual art forces engagement and reflection about that issue. So if you look at the slide, I can't remember which slide we're on now, possibly slide 10. You can see this work of art that's like a box with a light bulb in it. That's Boetti's 1966 Lampada annual lamp. It consists of a light bulb in a mirrored box, and it lights up for 11 seconds each year, only 11 seconds. And you might think, wow, this is just so dumb, right? Who would put a light bulb in a box? What is it even trying to illuminate? It only goes on for 11 seconds every year. What good is a light bulb if it doesn't light our path whenever we need it? And the way to, I think about this is to partially think about it in terms of a historical context. Because Boetti was part of the Art Povera movement, which attempted to address modernization and the industrial age and consumerist culture in the 60s and 70s, right? Like late 60s and 70s, by using everyday materials in their artworks. So instead of being a barely functioning source of light, if you think about it in terms of consumerist culture and modernization, you might think that it forces us to consider the passage of time in a modernizing world, or you might think that because it's only on for 11 seconds, the value of it is really created by scarcity, and that we think that art is particularly precious because it's so rare that we'll be able to catch it turn on at any point in time, things like that. Not necessarily comprehensive, but again, conceptual art really is about what you bring to it, right? Conceptual art causes viewers to engage in this really, really individualized process of intellectual exploration, in a sense. Because for conceptual art, the interpretive onus is not on the artist. We don't ask the artist to dictate to us what they meant by the artwork. It's on the spectator. The artwork means whatever we take from it. It doesn't matter what the original intent was. So we are asked to combine our own view of the artwork with our own existing ideas about the world, which leads us to come up with these entirely fresh and unique interpretations of what artworks are. So I guess you could say the second value of conceptual art is that it introduces critical judgment into the social sphere. I don't mean judgment like we judge the art for being ugly, but rather that on a cognitive level, conceptual art has a kind of value in it that pushes individuals to analyze and also judge in the process of spectating, because they have to participate in the art in order to gain any meaning from it. Crucially, because the process of judgment is based on the viewer rather than on technical skill and aesthetic detail, which I think does require a level of social privilege to analyze, you might be able to argue that conceptual art is actually more accessible to the public than technical art rather than less. Possibly, it's just a thought that you might want to keep in mind when debating like whether we should prioritize concepts or technical skills. The third benefit or value that conceptual art is probably able to give us is self-knowledge, which I know sounds like a really lame kind of value for art, but just hear me out a little bit. So conceptual art is often meant to be provocative, right? It's meant to elicit a reaction, a positive reaction, a negative reaction, something in between, a critical reaction. The point is that when we have emotional responses, when we're placed in a state of shock or we are jarred suddenly from our existing conceptions of what the world is or what life is, that kind of shock often causes us to react in a way that is very true to our inner selves. So in a moment of shock, you tend not to be able to dissemble. You tend not to be able to put on a facade. You don't often react in the way that you would want to react. And you don't react in a way that always fits your persona of who you are, your own conception of who you are. So those emotional responses in that very true moment of shock can often tell us something about ourselves. And at a bare minimum, we know that we will react in a particular way in response to certain concepts. And upon reflection, I think we may also realize that that kind of reaction says something about who we are in those kinds of unguarded moments. Okay, that sounded really abstract. So I'm going to move on a bit to some of the more socially oriented, practical reasons why art is valuable, the kinds of social change that it can create, etc. I've got some motions again that I think are going to be relevant to the kinds of concepts that we're going to be discussing in the next 20 minutes or so. The first motion is whether or not we support individuals having an obligation to not consume art from artists that have committed highly immoral actions. So whether or not we can separate the art from the artist, whether or not we think this leads to some kind of positive social change. The second motion is whether or not we will support government censoring art based on its offense value or based on its disgust value, or whether we think that this always just kind of leads to bad outcomes and we shouldn't do it. So moving on first to art and activism and what role art can play in creating political and social change. Slide 12. Yeah. So in many cases, art is a cultural tool for catalyzing social change, because a lot of artwork that depict atrocities can elicit very visceral reactions that shock people to act when they otherwise might not care enough to do anything about the situation. So earlier we talked about, when we were discussing conceptual art and cognitive values, we talked about how the value of art might be that it engages our emotional core, that it forces us to care about issues in a way that straight out statistics or essays wouldn't do. So they make us care about injustices in the world by humanizing the emotions, the fears of those people that have been affected by those injustices. They might not lead directly to policy change, but what art can do, and often does very well, is that it shifts the way a society thinks about and discusses an issue. So it changes existing societal narratives, it changes how people think about issues, which eventually is going to push them to vote in certain ways on certain issues, or push them to go out and campaign, or to strike, or to march and protest. Various small steps that do eventually lead to broader social outcomes. So on slide 12, the artwork that you see on the left hand of the slide is by Grant Furry. It's the very iconic "Silence Equals Death" poster that emerged as a response to Ronald Reagan's silence on the AIDS crisis in the US. His other campaigns challenged common misconceptions about the spread of HIV. So things about how kissing doesn't kill, but complacency does. And this artwork is very powerful because it's so striking. It really cuts to the core of the issue, and it did allow individuals to break free of some of the misconceptions that were surrounding HIV and AIDS and how they were spread, which then enabled them to push against the more reactionary neoconservative policies that were being pushed into place by the government. More recently, I guess, than this, American photojournalist James Nachtwey, he goes around the world photographing human rights violations, natural disasters, and other kinds of injustices, and his photographs have spurred both public conversations and public outrage about abuses of justice. So why is this the case? Well, it's because by seeing a painting, or by seeing a photograph, or by seeing somebody other than you suffer, you become a witness to their suffering. You find some kind of connection with the other that is being depicted. You find that if you believe what is being depicted in the artwork is true, it is very difficult to look away once you acknowledge the suffering of another person. It forces you to care about them in a sense, in the kind of creation of meaning that goes on, which often, I guess, spurs people to action. The second thing that art can do in terms of activism is to express struggles on the part of the artist, to communicate and to document those struggles, either on a personal level or on behalf of the group that they belong to. So, for example, spirituals that were sung by slaves actually laid the foundations for modern gospel music, for blues, for rap and jazz. And early gospel music like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and Wade in the Water was actually a way for slaves to communicate with each other about the Underground Railroad in a way that wasn't easily detectable. It helped slaves like communicate information about what kinds of concerns or what kinds of pitfalls they should avoid, or what kind of roadblocks or obstacles they might find in their way. Other ways of communication were that, because like music and other forms of art also work to orally communicate histories. When these histories might not be documented by marginalized groups because they were prevented from doing so, or because all records of their history were destroyed. And very often you find records of that history in terms of folk songs, in terms of artwork, or in terms of just oral traditions, stories that were being passed down for generations. So it helps artists communicate and document their struggles as part of a historical narrative that's often erased. And there are some initiatives to continue promoting this form of art. So refugee camps, for example, art created in refugee camps by migrants is often hugely important, because for these refugees, a lot of the historical narratives or documentation they had been destroyed with the destruction of whatever physical space they were fleeing from. Okay, so I think here I probably want to segue into talking about art and how art can be uniquely valuable to the artist as a means of expression, um, and why the content of art might be intrinsically tied to the identity of the artist. This should be slide 13, probably. And this is important because I think only if you can show there is some like really strong connection between art and artist, can you argue that people have a duty to not only boycott or like to not only decry the artist in the public sphere, but also to boycott their works and to refuse to listen to, say, music that has been created by somebody problematic. The way many people often try to argue this is by saying that art is often used to communicate a particular viewpoint or a particular argument. And in this view, art becomes a medium like any other, like a news column. And an artist can use that to convince somebody that poverty is bad, war is bad, Marxist revolution is good. But a problem with this kind of account, this kind of argument in motions, is that if art is just an argument that can be made from a dispassionate perspective, from a very neutral kind of standpoint, it's difficult to see why the identity of the artist has any kind of impact on it, right? If it's just about making an argument, why should I have to stop listening to a song just because a problematic artist made it? So it's probably strategic to think of art as being more personal than just expressing a viewpoint. Think of it as a way for artists to share how they experience the world and to communicate in a way that they feel can't be captured by words alone. So it expresses not just their arguments, but also, and this is quite important, also their emotions and desires. Because this is true, in many cases, art can be considered an extension of an artist's personality, right? Because they are using the art to create a world that they hope will happen, or a world that they think is important for other people to see. And in many cases, this art just becomes really weird when you consider how much it reflects the life of the artist. So take Woody Allen, for example. I don't think I have to explain why Woody Allen is problematic or the nature of allegations against him. But he produced a film called Manhattan, where he stars as this twice divorced 42-year-old comedy writer that's dating a 17-year-old girl. And I guess it was weird even before we knew about his sexual misconduct, but it becomes almost impossible to view outside the knowledge of his sexual misconduct now that this information has come up to the public. So it's very difficult to conceive of a world where we can judge this kind of art purely based on its artistic merit or its content, absent of any kind of context whatsoever. And I'll give you some positive examples, right, rather than we should avoid bad art. Very often, we judge whether or not we want to see a movie based on the actors that are in it. If there are good actors, we might be more inclined to see the movie. We watch a movie if we think the director is good. Again, if they're a good director, we'll be more inclined to see it. But that's still based on the content of art. So then take something like Beyonce's Lemonade, and it's almost impossible to imagine anybody else producing a work like that, because Lemonade as an art piece just interacts so much with her race and her gender that you can't divorce the art from the artist. And that applies to things that are not just identity categories as well, right? It also applies to what they've done with themselves. It also applies to what kinds of people they are. There's no reason why identity of an artist stops at their race and gender. It should also be broadly applicable to the kinds of actions that they take that make up their character. So if we already look to this like aspects of their identity to decide whether or not we watch their art or consume their art, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to judge art based on problematic things the artist has done in the past. I guess the other question that often comes up in this debate is like, but so many good artists have done so many bad things. A lot of artists do bad things, and if we stop looking at all of this art, our life would become aesthetically impoverished, right? So, Ezra Pound was an anti-Semite, right? Miles Davis physically abused women. Gauguin infected like half of Tahiti with syphilis. All of these artists just did very bad things, and we probably still think that this didn't impact the quality of their art. I guess this is empirically true in that many artists have done many bad things, and our lives would be diminished if we suddenly cut a huge chunk of art out of our lives. But we might think also that some moral violations are just so egregious as to merit our rejecting that kind of artwork altogether. So to give you a really extreme example, take Hitler, who was an aspiring artist. Suppose his paintings were technically brilliant. Suppose his paintings didn't depict anything objectionable. Suppose his paintings were worthy of being considered great art. Presumably, we would still think there is some kind of moral obligation on us to avoid consuming the art of somebody that has just done so many bad things on such a massive scale. And that's just a kind of intuition that I think many of us have that we should try to unpack in these kinds of debates. So in these cases, we might want to consider the nature of admiration. When we admire an artist's work, we often do so by buying and consuming their work. And in extreme cases, we give them awards like Grammys and Oscars and things like that. The problem with this is not necessarily that their artwork doesn't have artistic merit, but rather that it's all too easy to use these kinds of works and awards to excuse the actions of the artist. We hear ourselves saying things like, yeah, he did some bad things, but he writes really good songs. This one's really great. As though the two clauses kind of cancel each other out when they're said beside each other. This is weird because we would find this excuse abhorrent in any other context, right? Yes, he did some bad things, but he's a really productive employee. I think just that, like with the Me Too movement, we just find that this excuse doesn't quite hold water because your character should impact how we treat you, not just your ability to be productive at work. The public approval of something like record sales or awards is to say, yes, he did bad things, but that's okay because he writes good songs or produces good movies. Even if it's intended as some kind of aesthetic award and not as some kind of judgment of character, it often has the unintended effect of crowding out discourse about an artist's immoral acts, right? And crucially, we might want to question how this reflects how we allocate blame and sympathy in real life. How very often when we have things like sexual assault cases or when we have things like gun violence, we find ourselves making all kinds of excuses for the people that committed those crimes, and we don't find ourselves making the same excuses for people impacted by those crimes. So, for example, when you have young, privileged white boys committing sexual assaults, like the Stanford case, yes, he did a bad thing, but he's in Stanford. He's a star swimmer. He's an athlete. Yes, this man did some bad things. He shot some people, but he was always such an upstanding student. The allocations of sympathies often aligns with the kinds of power structures that we have in the world. And I think it's remarkably disingenuous to think that you can appreciate the work of somebody without ever considering how you are apportioning your sympathy in this case, because I think that this kind of discourse very often crowds out the discourse of people who have been affected deeply by the artist's actions and the works of the artist. So we should probably prioritize their points of view over his point of view, because there's no reason why we prioritize his point of view just because he's an artist whose works we want to consume. Note that this is actually quite a separate question from the practical one of whether or not boycotting art creates some kind of change for the artist. You will, in these debates, have to engage in the arguments about like how not consuming immoral art hurts record sales, or how it doesn't actually change bad behavior, or how it hurts other people who also worked on the same film. But I think the principal question is actually far more interesting. And in the absence of settling the principal question, it's nice to have independent reasons why consuming art by immoral artists might also be immoral and a thing that we might want to avoid. So, having talked about immoral artists, I think we should probably talk about immoral art, insofar as there is such a thing as immoral art. So, probably the closest approximation would be like art that depicts immoral things, or art that is deliberately created to be offensive and controversial, or art that is just inadvertently offensive and controversial through no intent of the artist. Um, Censorship of offensive art, like I said earlier, is one of those debates that isn't really about art. So many of the arguments raised will be about the nature of offense, so whether or not offense is a legitimate harm to those who see it, and the nature of censorship, whether or not censorship can ever be applied in an equitable manner. And these arguments can actually be made without ever discussing the value of art or the nature of artwork. Some things to note for this debate. The first is that the same artwork can cause uproar in one community but often have no effect in the other. And this is because of the second thing, which is that artwork often incites conflict when its display coincides with some kind of deep and fundamental value clash within society. What do I mean by that? I guess there are some clear examples of artwork that have enraged a good portion of society. And two of the most common examples that come up in art offense debate rounds are Piss Christ and the Holy Virgin Mary. And both of these works involve religious icons and bodily waste. So Piss Christ is a photograph of a crucifix suspended in urine, which has been attacked by vandals just multiple times. And the Holy Virgin Mary, for those of you that are on the slides, you can see it, I think, on slide 14, is a mixed media painting of the Virgin Mary that depicts her as black and incorporates elephant dung and images from pornographic films and blaxploitation films. More recent examples of religious art that has been quite offensive are the Charlie Hebdo depictions, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, and the Jelens Posten Prophet Muhammad cartoons, in the Danish newspaper Muhammad cartoons. All of these are examples of controversy surrounding depictions of religion. They're not really debates about art, but rather about how religion is depicted and how far we think freedom of religion extends. Some other examples that are not about religion. So, post the Me Too movement, Balthasar's Therese Dreaming came under fire because it depicted a girl with her legs propped up, and like her underwear showing, as did Waterhouse's Hylas and the Nymphs. So, it's another instance of the interpretation of art changing as different value clashes arise. So, where do art-specific arguments come in when none of these concerns are really about art? I guess one could argue, and probably should argue, that provocative art shouldn't be censored because of the unique value it sends to society. And if characterized robustly enough, this argument has the potential to outweigh arguments about the harms created by offense or arguments about why censorship is justified. So one might consider, for example, that almost every authoritarian regime that has existed has also attempted to control or eradicate the arts. So Nazi Germany separated art into acceptable art, which depicts an ideal Aryan society, and spirit art, which consisted of abstract art or art by communists or art by Jews or art by other social groups that were considered undesirable. The Stalinist government systematically executed Ukrainian folk poets and required art to meet really strict standards and regulations on content set by the state in order to ensure that there were no artworks criticizing the legitimacy of the state. After taking power in Chile, Pinochet's regime tortured and killed artists and muralists. Danilo Maldonado was arrested for criticizing the Castro regime. Ai Weiwei was arrested for criticizing the government and democratic freedoms in China. Lots of authoritarian states have imprisoned artists or killed them. And the reason this is important is because art is often wielded by authoritarian states as a political tool. Because art that depicts an ideal society in line with the state's vision can help the state consolidate power, while art that challenges the state is often suppressed because it questions the foundations that the state is built on. And art is quite unique in being able to challenge the state because it teaches us that lives other than our own, lives other than the ones that we are currently living, can have value. Art provides a voice for the voiceless. It enables them to show why current regimes and institutions are problematic and suggests for them, therefore, a better way to live. This is actually hugely important because if you think about the questions of who gets to deem things offensive, I'm just going to guess that very often definitions can be set by the government, or at the very least set by a majority group that probably has interest in maintaining an incumbent government. And if that is the case, then offense itself has too slippery a definition to allow into the hands of a government that is attempting to consolidate power. Because when you are able to censor art purely based on some kinds of imaginary effect that is created, it often means that governments have free license to restrict art that challenges whether or not they should be in power. And it restricts the ability of individuals to protest this kind of consolidation of power. So while they might still have other avenues, this removes a really, really important one, right? Because we've already talked a lot about how emotional responses in art often make it a means of communication and other means of communication. I think other things to think about in this debate is just like who gets to control what gets censored. And quite often in clashes over if 70% of the society thinks it's offensive, will censor it, the minority group always loses out because there's always a lot of uproar when majority religions or majority power structures get attacked, but not similar amounts of uproar when punching down happens, in essence, right? When there are comedians that make fun of minority identities, or when there are instances of artwork that depicts minority religions in particularly offensive manners. Because in those cases, the idea that a majority often promotes is that this kind of artwork needs to happen because there is something inherently problematic with these religious structures, or this needs to happen because free speech is quite important, even if it, and these are the kinds of things that would often not happen if the majority felt that their own interests were being impinged upon. So some other examples of controversial art include Exhibit B, which I think is quite an interesting thing to look up because it's a recreation of human zoos meant to critique the concept of, back in Europe when they actually had human zoos, and Open Casket, which is a portrait of Emmett Till, a black teenager who was lynched by two white men in, I think, the 30s. And in both cases, a white artist created an art piece meant to critique, racialized power structures. And while, of course, this isn't all there is to the controversy surrounding these two pieces, it does raise the question of who has the right to represent and profit off certain issues in society. Like, do all artists get to say whatever they want? Do all artists get to use whatever medium they want? Or do representations specifically belong only to certain minority groups? So, representation in art. If you go to slide 16, I'm going to be talking about representation in the media, followed by talking a bit about cultural appropriation, and then about repatriating art to its countries of origins. And I think all of these things are relatively interlinked. On slide 16, what you actually see is a Banksy print, I think. It's a Banksy print in New York City, probably somewhere there. Okay, so some motions that I think are relevant about representation. The first is when casting minority characters. This house believes that films should only cast actors from that same minority. Comes up quite a bit about blind casting, about whether or not you should say that only certain people have the right to represent certain experiences on screen, about whether or not you think these groups of individuals will have enough support to make the movie a success. The second motion is this house supports the recasting of male action heroes and superheroes as female. So this is an iteration that comes out slightly less often. You might also see it in terms of whether or not we should recast in favor of minorities. So, for example, if Superman or James Bond should be recast as individuals of a different race. And the last motion is this house believes that all museums, galleries, and cultural institutions should offer to return or just return exhibits to their countries and communities of origin. So I'm going to start with media representation and what the importance of representation is. If you go to slide 18, the photo there is of Misty Copeland. And Misty Copeland's really important because ballet is usually very white, and Misty is the first African-American female principal dancer with the American Ballet Theatre. It's a huge accomplishment. So representation. In debates about representation, I think it's useful for teams to be able to explain in detail what impacts representation has on viewers. So one of the big mistakes I often see happening in debates about representation is that teams take representation as an assumed good and don't bother explaining why they think it's important or significant. This is bad because you really need to ground the value of representation to prevent opposition from outweighing it with arguments about backlash or arguments about like profit or arguments about tokenization, for example. Because if you can't prove representation is important, it's not clear why any kind of film should make waves in its casting to forward some kind of weird, intangible, unimportant goal. Okay, so the question then becomes, is representation valuable enough to outweigh all other issues that might arise? Obviously, debates about casting, like blind casting, also has a different dimension. It's about justice and equity of access to various industries, very similar to affirmative action debates, and I won't really be going into that. So how does representation work in art or in media or otherwise? One of the frequent analogies that come up is one that compares the media to a mirror, in that it reflects both what society is and in many cases what society should be. So in some sense, if you look into a mirror and you don't see yourself reflected, it is a sign that you don't exist in the kind of world or the kind of society that the media wants to portray, and by extension, the kind of world that the majority of its consumers want to see. When we consume media, we are forming our own opinions and beliefs, right? Not just of ourselves, but also of the world around us. Art, movies, and stories just inform our perspectives on everything. It's all pervasive now, right? We wake up, we listen to music while commuting, we watch television shows when we want to distress, we go for movies with our friends. We look to the media for guidance. We look to it to find characters or narratives that we relate to. Through finding those characters and narratives, we attempt to understand ourselves. And if we are very, very lucky, we see characters who are very like us. We see the characters with the same looks, the same mannerisms, the same manner of speech, the same dreams that we have. And when we can find someone like that, when we see a character that can represent us and our hopes and dreams, and we see them succeed, we are assured that we are not alone. I can succeed because somebody else that looks just like me has succeeded. because somebody else who wants the same thing that I do, who has the same education as I do, managed to get what I wanted. When we don't see them, we think that we must be incapable of succeeding because others who look like us just haven't done so. And this is partially applicable to what happens in the media industry as well. If you want to talk about things like access to job opportunities, because minority children, I think, may feel in some cases that the media industry isn't for them because they never see actors that look like them. But I think it's more important to think about it in terms of the kinds of narratives that are created when they are constantly underrepresented and are never shown as the kinds of protagonists and heroes of their own story. For a lot of minority characters, they're relegated to the sidelines. They tend to be the sidekicks, never the main character of whatever movie or TV show you're watching. And when you constantly find that the characters that you relate the most to, or the characters that seem the most like you, are not centered, then your self-worth becomes slightly undermined because you don't see yourself as playing a central role even in your own life sometimes. But I think more than that, your potential becomes limited and circumscribed in the eyes of society because there is a collective failure of imagination that occurs if society never sees minorities being featured in lead roles. If that doesn't happen, it does not occur to society to imagine that non-white, non-male individuals can also be rich, can also be successful, can be CEOs, journalists, actors, doctors, love interests, everything else, etc. Instead, women or queer individuals or people of color are reduced in society's mind to very, very stereotypical or one-dimensional figures without thoughts, feelings, or agency. What then happens? The first thing is just that whiteness and maleness becomes the default human being. When you don't specify something about a character, people automatically default to imagining them as being white and male. So in Harry Potter, for example, people just tended to default to imagining all three of the main characters as being white, despite the fact that their race was never mentioned in the books, I think. And in the Hunger Games, there was a lot of uproar when the character Rue was cast as black in the films because even though her skin color was never specified within the books, people just defaulted to the idea that all characters were white and belonging to like the majority race, right? Even in a post-apocalyptic society, race still matters. That's bad because we end up attributing a lot of positive qualities to only a certain set of experiences. So talent and beauty gets attributed to the majorities, whereas everybody that looks different ends up being seen as deviating from the norm and are less appealing as a result. Like Asian accents sound different, Asian actors look different. And we've already talked about this a little bit earlier in discussing art and activism, right? Because it's where we discussed why this is just bad in terms of not being able to express your own experiences in a way that's authentic. So last of all, I just want to quickly talk about narratives and narrative control. And this is because about representation also involve discussing things like whitewashing when casting or whitewashing historical events. So one of the motions that came up at Hart House IV 2 years ago was this house opposes films and TV shows that depict a minority narrative through a white heteronormative lens. So that's basically about this. Whitewashing when casting happens fairly often. So Emma Stone was cast as a Hawaiian Asian character in Aloha, despite the fact that she's really white and blonde. Mackenzie Davis, who's also white and blonde, was cast as a Korean American in The Martian. Tilda Swinton, again quite white and quite blonde, was cast as the Ancient One in Doctor Strange, despite the character being originally meant to be Asian. So this process, the idea that you should cast somebody who's a big name just to draw in viewers, essentially trades off minority experiences in favor of majority participation. And that's how I think debates like this ought to be framed. What does this do? It erases minority actors, right? Because it means that they're not represented. And it strips away their agency to control and reclaim troubling characterizations of themselves. Quite often, because actors do have some leeway in terms of how they're represented and should be able to push against scriptwriters and producers if they find something to be inherently problematic or dismissive of their culture in a way that as belonging to a majority race just wouldn't be able to do. The second problem with whitewashing in movies or TV shows is with how important historical achievements, end up being attributed to white individuals. So, two examples here. The first is Oliver Stone's World Trade Center film in '06. Both of the two characters that rescued the protagonists, Sergeant Jason Thomas and Sergeant David Carnes, were cast as white actors, despite the fact that in real life, Sergeant Thomas is an African American man. And the problem is that it's a biopic and it didn't get the facts right. And so the overwhelming impression everybody's going to have of the historical event as it happened were that the two rescuers who were first on the scene were two white men, despite the fact that this just isn't true. And because those facts weren't preserved, and because the film didn't fulfill its obligation to educate the audience on the facts of the event, you get all the harms of representation that we talked about earlier. The second example is more recent. It's a Stonewall film that I think came out about 2 or 3 years ago. So in reality, Stonewall riots were largely incited by drag queens, lesbians, trans women of color, which is cool, right? Because real life. But in the movie, the main character was this white man, played by a white actor from the Midwest, who was very blonde, looked very corn-fed, looked very fit in a white t-shirt. But the various characters that were closer to the real demographic of the Stonewall riots were hidden in the background and were sidelined just to facilitate the protagonist in his actions, right? Because the protagonist, Jeremy Irvine, is going around trying to rally all of these people when in real life that's not what happened. So the impact of this is that Stonewall basically, first of all, erases history. It erases the contributions of minority characters to just really important flashpoints in history, and says that most of the important events in history were just caused by white men. And the second thing it does is that it tells people, or it sends a message to people that nobody cares what actually happened unless there is a white man at the center of the story. Again, bad for representational reasons as well as narrative reasons, because all the harms of representation that I just talked about with representation in the media basically gets doubled in terms of the lack of representation in historical narratives. So, having talked a lot about representation, I'm going to pose a question, which is that who gets to tell stories and who gets to use art forms? I think this is a good time to start talking about cultural appropriation and just who gets to do things, who gets to represent or be represented. So when you have motions like this house regrets the success of white actors who co-opt minority-dominated music subcultures like rap and jazz, and this house believes that white entertainers should refrain from using cultural modes of expression that come from minority cultures, these motions come up quite a bit. I think it's important to consider what culture is, what art is, how that relates to identities, and whether anyone gets to own them. I'm going to just quickly run through what I think some of the big issues on both sides are, and this should probably be slide 19. Slide 19's picture is Miranda Kerr, a supermodel, on the cover of Vogue, dressed like a geisha. Lots of backlash on that one because cultural appropriation and Orientalism. So arguments that white entertainers should not be using minority art forms, those arguments are quite similar to the issues we discussed earlier, just with a side helping of cultural appropriation. Let's first look at how cultural expressions work at shaping identity. Part of your identity comes from how people outside of your group perceive you. That's why we spend time curating our social media presence and our personal experiences and lots of other things. The problem comes when we have little to no control over those kinds of perceptions, and our identity then becomes in part defined by another group's commodified construction of who they think you are. I think it's reasonable to say that even if you want to um, be well intentioned in terms of how you're using another group's culture, most instances of cultural appropriation tend to be quite clumsy and insensitive just based on how it occurs. So cultures are quite often pared down to their simplest elements, not what the other groups intended, maybe, but that's generally how it occurs. Because groups tend to pick up on characteristics and styles and music or clothing that they associate with coolness and exoticism that's often removed from the kinds of cultural context that these things are meant to be understood in. And part of the reason for that is just because these things are more marketable, right? You can't market an entire culture's worth of history along with the art form. What you do is that you pick out specific bits of it, like cornrows or kimonos or I don't know, Native American headdresses, and you find a commercial market for it because those things are quite easy to sell and you can often sell them with a kind of costumey element, right? That's where a lot of controversy comes from with Halloween costumes. Because of the market pressures, it often means that you get individuals knowing very little about the culture that these things originate from, being able to pick them up and use them as they wish. The impact of this is that the culturally coded meanings in these objects or in this form of music or form of art gets replaced with a sort of colorblind meaning where everybody gets to use everything and culture belongs to no one, which I think is not true, especially if you belong to a minority culture and you feel quite attached to aspects of your own culture. Which leads to the second reason why this might be a bad thing, which is just that it makes it much more difficult for marginalized groups to create identities that empower them. So it might be empowering for you to be able to evoke traditional art forms or traditional modes of dress. You might gain meaning and fulfillment from it. You might be able to create a kind of identity around it. I'm using might a lot here because I don't want to speak for every single minority person because everyone relates to cultures in a different way. So the problem is that there's just white hegemony in the music industry and Hollywood, which hijacks the kind of discourse that can surround your culture, right? Because the access to that kind of platform is predominantly white, it makes it easier for white entertainers and white artists to craft a narrative that goes further than minority narratives are able to go. They're able to reach subsets that minority artists just aren't able to reach. So this hijacks the discourse because it denies minority groups the ability to craft non-white narratives. They have a limited ability to push back against it. And the third reason why this is bad is just because there are just differentiated impacts in terms of who can access culture in real life. So very recently, there was a huge uproar in America because of this white blonde girl that wore a qipao, a traditional Chinese dress, to her prom. And what she said on Twitter was that she thought that this was a beautiful and modest dress that was slightly unusual, and she was happy to wear it. A lot of the comments that came in were about how beautiful she looked in the dress, and the backlash she received from the Asian American community described how the reactions that she had from wearing the dress were quite different from what a member of the Asian American community would receive if they were the ones wearing the dress. So, because of differential levels of powers in society, white people can do things and be like wear things or do things that can be considered cool. Whereas if a minority kid did the same thing, they would be considered weird or other. If it happened to be particularly racialized, they could be considered thugs or gangsters or vandals. A lot of things like this that mean that even though everybody can theoretically listen to the same music, not everybody is able to access those kinds of expressions in the same way. There's a huge asymmetry of power there. So your engagement as a minority member in that culture is mocked, whereas other people's engagement in your culture is celebrated. I guess another example of this that particularly irks me is with how the Western chefs often discover Asian food and then hipster it up. So, for example, kimchi made out of pineapples that's being sold as gourmet kimchi for a ridiculously jacked up price. Whereas for most other kinds of Asian food, it gets like devalued in the eyes of society and is sold at a tremendously depressed price because people don't see the value of paying for food unless it's created by like a white culture, I guess. Okay, but that's kind of the point. What should we say on the opposition side about why people should be able to use various kinds of art forms? The first is just an idea that culture develops organically over time. That is a common humanity and an impulse for art that is inspired by everything that preceded it. And it's also not clear whether or not there are any pure forms of art that exist. So it's not clear what a world would look like if we were unable to reference all forms of art. Like, can we reference jazz, which originated from the Black community? Can we reference, can we reference tea? I don't know. Just lots of things that go pretty far back that we shouldn't be able to use if we were really stuck on cultural purity. The second idea is that it essentializes cultures in a bit, that it says only certain groups can have certain cultures. It categorizes them, which reinforces this myth of fragile minority culture because it says that once you dip into that culture, the culture automatically breaks and will never be the same again. When in reality, culture tends to evolve and shift to encompass new influences all the time, right? So the problem with not doing that is that it museumizes and fossilizes the idea of minority art as exotic and other. You might even say that this kind of dabbling in other people's art forms is a way for you to test imaginary boundaries, to question what the links between culture and race really are. So if you think about our cultural identity, a lot of it is quite performative, right? It's not necessarily intrinsic to our being. So in many cases, you might want to argue, you might like want to think about how being able to opt into various forms of culture that might not belong to you but speak better to your experience makes you feel. The third argument is a practical one, which is just that you get more of that kind of art if that particular art form succeeds. And the idea here is that maybe, yes, Hollywood is white and very dominated by certain conceptions of culture, but once you have a white artist breaking into that industry, you create new markets for minority artists to also sell their art. So rap, for example, is now more popular because white artists have started rapping, and now you have a larger market for black rap artists to sell to. That's a theory, at least. It's not clear if that actually happens or that art just kind of gets crowded out. But it's a practical reason why we might be like okay with people using different forms of art. So this discussion about cultural context and the interpretation of art separate from context allows us to also talk about things like repatriating art to its country of origin and the ownership of art, like whether or not we think that people should give art back or whether we should prohibit private ownership of art that's deemed to be culturally or historically significant. Because this is also a discussion about who gets to control art historical narratives. If you look at the slide about repatriating art, I've got some examples about the kinds of artworks that are being that are subjects of contention right now. So on the left is a picture of the Nefertiti bust that Egypt is trying to recover from the British Museum. Well, I can't remember if it's from the British Museum or some museum somewhere else, but a museum somewhere in Europe. They're also trying to recover the Rosetta Stone. Greece is trying to recover the Elgin marbles, again from the British Museum. India is trying to recover the Koh-i-Noor diamond. So I guess it's the question of who gets to own art and why we think art should be situated in particular contexts. The easy argument to make is the argument that you should return art because it's just very intuitive that if you got art from places that aren't yours and you got it in illegal ways, it's probably a moral obligation for you to return them. The appropriate parallel to draw would be that there isn't this kind of controversy over returning Nazi looted art from Jewish artists. it seems strange, therefore, that we think there's some kind of controversy about returning art that was looted from colonies by colonial powers. Historical artifacts often shape the construction of how we see countries and national identities. And colonial looting, the kinds of art that we're mostly talking about, is a function of colonial rule, right? Because holding onto your art piece right now and seeing no reason to return it is kind of an indication of how the country that holds the art still sees itself as being dominant over its previous colonies, right? Because it thinks that its ownership is justified and there's no need to return the art, stolen goods. Having these pieces in museums also make tangible reminders of previous and current power structures, where you have individuals literally traveling across the world in order to see something from their own culture and history, where you get countries being able to consolidate their place in the world, not just by having economic power, but also by being seen as the cultural centers of the world in a sense. It's kind of like a soft power thing. On the other hand, and this is very similar to the stuff we just talked about in terms of who gets to use particular art cultures, you could say that artifacts are also part of a universal human history, and that museums like the British Museum and the Louvre and the Met cultivate the dissemination of knowledge and tolerance and broad cultural understanding. So having artwork disseminated around the world actually encourages scholarship and professional exchange. And there are also some arguments that you might make about why people don't actually have a claim to art that belonged to cultures that existed hundreds of years before they were actually born, and we should ensure that everybody has access to this art because there are valuable things to be gained from the viewing of it. So accessibility is really the most important thing here. There are also some like side arguments in these kinds of debates about safety of art and like how ISIS tends to destroy art that it comes across. Remember when we were talking about authoritarian regimes destroying arts? It's also a good example of it. But I think those arguments are relatively minor in the course of the debate, because even though one side can basically say, but we save art from being destroyed in its home country, the other side can just easily point out that transportation of art, which is like pretty delicate, isn't great for art either. So the Elgin marbles were actually damaged in their transportation to Britain. So it's not clear to me that anybody really like wins the safety clash unless some team is able to blow up the safety clash quite dramatically from one side. I think that is all I am going to say for the museums thing. I just want to end up by talking very quickly again about strategies when it comes to art debate. I think the first thing to just keep in mind is to not panic. You don't always need examples for art debates. Something that's useful might be to keep 2 or 3 examples of each form of art in your mind so you are able to whip them out at a moment's notice. So knowing some examples of conceptual art, for example, that aren't totally crazy and totally not understandable to the public would really help you if you had to defend conceptual art, because you can say that things like fountain are really the outliers, or things like artist shit is also an outlier. The second thing about art debates is that you should often consider the value people get from art, not just from the viewer's perspective, but from the artist's perspective. And this also applies to debates about movies and media, where you start thinking about actors and representation. So it's not just what the audience sees, but why it might also be important for the actor to be in a particular role. The last thing for art debates is that please just remember to make arguments about the value of art instead of assuming those arguments and going straight for all the practical impacts of whether or not we should ban something or whether or not we should boycott something. Because arguments about banning or boycotting need a grounding in whether or not we think something is valuable in the first place. And I feel like teams often skip those steps, which makes the debate far less interesting and complex than it could otherwise be. Oh, last thing, don't be worried if your arguments sound like they're low impact. That's fine. Impacts don't have to be nuclear impacts in order for them to be important. Art is important to us, not because it leads to us changing the world, right? It's important to us. I mean, it can change the world, but it's important to us because it makes us feel things, and it makes us better people. It's like saying that the purpose of laughter is relaxation, when really the purpose of laughter is just to laugh. And I guess that's really all I have to say about art and culture and art debates. Thank you to everyone that's watching. Please message me if you've got any questions. I'm going to throw in a list of references and a bibliography, as well as a list of paintings that I talked about into the PowerPoint slide. So it's good. It might change, so you might want to check back if you're looking at it right now and it's not it doesn't look fully complete. So thank you all again. Good night.